This is a story about a man who spent nearly 4 decades being quietly judged by his wife's wealthy family. He was never loud, never confrontational. He accepted their looks, their comments, and their silence. What they never understood was this. His calm wasn't weakness. It was choice. One dinner, meant to remind him of his place, ends up exposing a truth no one at the table was prepared for. Careers shift. Power changes hands. And a man who never demanded respect finally stops denying the truth. If you enjoy real family stories that unfold slowly and stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing. These stories aren't about drama. They're about life, dignity, and the moments that quietly change everything. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Now let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room already knowing you weren't welcome? But you went anyway? Not because you enjoyed it. Not because you expected anything to change. But because sometimes love asks you to endure things quietly. That's how it felt when my wife told me about the invitation. "It's dinner," she said. "All of us." He says it's important. Important. In 37 years of marriage, her father had used that word only a handful of times. Funerals. Formal milestones. Moments where appearances mattered more than people. Never just dinner. I didn't ask why. I already knew. My name is Thomas. I'm in my early 60s now. I've been married to my wife for almost 4 decades, and we live a simple life in a small, quiet home. Nothing fancy. The kind of place where you know your neighbors by name, and the evenings are calm enough to hear your own thoughts. Her family never understood that life. From the beginning, I was never quite right in their eyes. I didn't talk like them. I didn't spend like them. I didn't measure success the way they did. At family gatherings, conversations would pause when I entered, then resume without me. No hostility. Just absence. And absence teaches you things. It teaches you when to speak, and when not to. It teaches you how to smile without expecting warmth in return. It teaches you how to sit at the edge of a table and not take up space. My wife noticed it long before I did. She saw the way her father looked past me. The way he introduced everyone except me. The way he spoke about me instead of to me. But she chose me anyway. We built a life outside that world. We raised our daughter quietly. We lived simply. And for a long time, that was enough. Until that invitation arrived. The house we were invited to was the kind that made statements before you ever walked inside. Wide driveway. Tall doors. Cars worth more than our entire home. Everything about it said, you should be impressed. I wasn't. But I was alert. Because people don't suddenly invite you after years of indifference unless they want something. Or they want to remind you of where they think you belong. As we drove there that evening, rain tapping softly against the windshield, a strange feeling settled in my chest. Not fear. Not anger. Certainty. That whatever this dinner was about, it wasn't really about family. And by the time dessert arrived, nothing would ever feel the same again. Because sometimes, the quietest people in the room are the ones holding the biggest truths. Have you ever realized that disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly? Sometimes it shows up in the handshake that never comes. In the way your name is skipped. In the way people speak around you, not to you. That's how it was with my wife's family. From the beginning, it was clear I didn't fit the picture they had imagined. When my wife and I married, the ceremony was small and simple. Her parents didn't attend. There were no arguments. No ultimatums. Just absence. And absence can be louder than anger if you let it. Her father never said I wasn't good enough. He didn't have to. Over time, his silence did that work for him. At holidays, he would stand at the center of the room, telling stories about business, investments, and connections. People leaned in. People laughed. When my wife and I arrived, the conversation paused just long enough to acknowledge her. Never me. And then continued as if I hadn't walked in at all. At first I tried. I dressed better. I spoke carefully. I stayed informed. But no matter what I said, it landed softly and disappeared quickly. Questions about my work sounded polite, not curious. Compliments, when they came, felt like consolation. "Oh, that's nice. At least you're steady." Steady. It sounded kind. It wasn't meant to be. My wife noticed everything. Every omission. Every slight. Every moment I was placed just outside the circle. Sometimes she challenged it. Sometimes she squeezed my hand under the table. Sometimes we said nothing, and talked about it later, in the quiet of our own home. We built our life deliberately away from that world. A modest house. A slower pace. Dinners that didn't require performance. Our daughter grew up learning that worth isn't measured by titles or income, but by how you treat people when no one is watching. That choice didn't earn us respect. It earned us pity. At gatherings, I'd overhear comments disguised as concern. "He works hard, but she could have had more. They live so simply." As if simplicity were failure instead of decision. They never asked why we lived the way we did. They assumed they already knew. People always do when they think they've figured you out. Over time, I stopped correcting them. I listened instead of responding. Observed instead of explaining. Not because I was weak, but because some arguments cost more than they're worth. Years passed like that. My wife stayed loyal, even when it hurt. She chose our family over her father's approval every single day. And I loved her more for it than she ever knew. Still, there were quiet moments when I wondered how long this balance could hold. Because respect withheld doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And eventually it demands to be addressed. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner invitation wasn't just another uncomfortable evening. It was the moment all those silent years were about to collide. With a truth no one at the table was ready for. Because disrespect grows strongest. Where silence lasts the longest. Have you ever noticed how people assume they know your limits? Just because you never talk about them? That was the quiet advantage I carried for most of my life. While my wife's family decided who I was based on appearances. I learned early that explaining yourself to people who've already judged you is usually a waste of breath. So I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I didn't correct. I let them believe whatever made them comfortable. What they never knew, what almost no one knew, was that my life had taken a very different turn. Long before I married into their family. I didn't grow up wealthy. I grew up careful. Observant. The kind of person who notices patterns. And waits. Years before my wedding, my grandfather passed away. What he left behind wasn't flashy. No stacks of cash. No headlines. It was ownership, quiet ownership. In places most people never see. Land. Long-term investments. Agreements designed to mature slowly. At first, I didn't even understand what I'd inherited. Not money, potential. Patient. Unassuming. Powerful over time. I treated it the same way I treated everything else in my life. Cautiously. I didn't quit my job. I didn't upgrade my lifestyle. I didn't tell friends or neighbors. I didn't even tell my wife at first. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I needed to understand it myself. Before it became part of our life. Money changes conversations. It changes expectations. It changes how people listen. I didn't want any of that. So I stayed quiet. I worked. I saved. I reinvested. I watched numbers grow slowly. Without drama. While others chased recognition. I focused on stability. While people spent to be seen. I learned how much freedom comes from not needing to impress anyone. By the time my wife's family had fully decided, I was simple and limited. My life had already moved. Somewhere they never imagined. And then, almost by accident, our worlds intersected. Her father's company came up in conversation one evening. Struggling quietly. Expanding too fast. Confident in momentum, careless with discipline. I listened. I read. I ran numbers out of curiosity, not intention. What I saw surprised me. The company wasn't weak. It was undervalued. Strong assets. Poor restraint. So I invested. Not publicly. Not personally. Quietly. Through structures designed to stay invisible. At first, it was small. Just enough to observe. Over time, as others hesitated, my involvement grew. Slowly. Intentionally. I never interfered. Never asked for recognition. It wasn't about control. It was just business. Years passed. The company survived storms it shouldn't have. Expanded when others faltered. All while I lived the same quiet life. Same home. Same routines. Same assumptions surrounding me. That's the strange thing about silence. People mistake it for emptiness. They never imagine what it's holding. And by the time they realize they were wrong, the truth feels almost unbelievable. What they mistook for simplicity was actually patience. And very soon, that patience was about to meet a dinner table, where everyone thought they knew exactly who I was. Have you ever walked into a room and understood your position before anyone spoke? That's what happened. The moment we arrived, the house made the rules clear. Wide doors, high ceilings, polished surfaces that reflected light and status. Everything about it announced success loudly, as if silence might cause it to disappear. A house like that doesn't welcome people. It evaluates them. We were led into the dining room by someone I didn't recognize. A long table stretched across the space, set with precision. 6 place settings. And it was immediately obvious where each of us belonged. My wife and I were guided to the far end. Her father sat at the head, of course. Upright. Confident. Comfortable in authority. His wife beside him. Their son across the table, already leaning forward. Like he owned the conversation before it began. The seating said everything. No one intended to say out loud. Dinner began politely. Safe topics. Predictable compliments. My wife was acknowledged. Our daughter, who arrived a little late from work, was tolerated with thin patience. No one asked why she was late. No one asked what kind of work she'd been doing. That curiosity had never existed. After the first course, her father set his fork down. The sound alone quieted the room. "I'll be direct," he said. "I'm not getting any younger." This wasn't concern. It was announcement. He spoke about legacy. About responsibility. About continuity. His son nodded along, already accepting praise he hadn't earned. Then came the reveal. Leadership changes. Control shifting hands. Plans already decided. Long before we'd arrived. My wife listened carefully. I felt her tense beside me. When her role in the future was summarized in a few neat sentences. Not excluded. Reduced. Enough to appear fair. Not enough to matter. Our daughter was mentioned briefly. Financially. Not personally. A solution, not a relationship. Then, for the first time that evening, he turned to me. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said, as if I'd asked him to. "At your age, stability matters. I've arranged something for you." He spoke slowly. A job. Entry level. Modest pay. Respectable benefits. Framed as generosity. Offered the way charity is offered, while being called opportunity. The room went still. My wife started to speak. I stopped her gently. Not because I needed to defend myself, but because I wanted to hear how far he would go. "You'll report to my son," he added. "I expect punctuality and effort." Then he smiled. "This is a chance to finally contribute properly." Contribute. The word settled heavily between us. Even his son shifted uncomfortably. That's when I understood something. This dinner wasn't about succession. It was about hierarchy. About reminding everyone, especially me, where they believed I belonged. I looked around the table. At the practiced confidence. The careful expressions. And something settled quietly inside me. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was intention. And for the first time in nearly 4 decades, I knew this wasn't a moment to endure. It was a moment to decide. Because some dinners aren't about food. They're about power. And I was done pretending. I didn't understand the difference. Have you ever noticed how people reveal who they really are? When you don't react the way they expect? That was the moment the room changed. I thanked him for the offer. Calmly. Politely. The way you do. When you're being tested. And refused to fail on someone else's terms. Then I said, I'm going to decline. The reaction was immediate. Confusion first. Then disbelief. And finally irritation. Sharp enough to cut through the polite atmosphere he'd worked so hard to maintain. Decline? He repeated. You don't understand what I'm offering. I understand perfectly, I said. I'm just not interested. That's when his tone shifted. He leaned back, glanced around the table, and laughed, not because anything was funny, but because laughter made him feel in control. At your age, he said, most men would be grateful. He smiled thinly. You've lived a simple life. Limited opportunities. This is a way to finish strong. Finish strong. As if my life had been a long apology. My wife's hand tightened around mine. I felt years of restraint pressing against her silence. I'm comfortable where I am, I said. That was the wrong answer. His voice grew louder. Less careful. You've been lucky, he said. My daughter could have had more. A better life. Then he looked directly at her. Instead, she chose simplicity. She chose you. The words weren't meant to hurt me. They were meant to wound her. That's when she stood. Enough, she said. Steady. Firm. You don't get to speak about my husband like that. He waved her off. This doesn't concern you. She laughed once, short and disbelieving. You just insulted my husband. In front of our daughter. Of course it concerns me. He turned back to me. Unwilling to lose control. For decades, he said, I've watched you hold her back. That small house. That old car. No ambition. No progress. There it was. Not concern. Not disappointment. Contempt. He didn't see love. He saw lack. And something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. Silence wasn't protecting anyone anymore. Not me. Not my wife. Not our daughter, who sat watching her grandfather measure worth in numbers. And dismiss everything else. I stood slowly. Not dramatically. Not defiantly. Just decisively. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said. He frowned. What are you talking about? I looked around the table one last time. At the faces. The assumptions. The hierarchy they believed was fixed. This dinner, I said, was never about offering me anything. I paused. It was about reminding me of my place. The room went silent. And for the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. Because he realized something important. I wasn't upset. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't asking for approval. I was preparing to tell the truth. And once some lines are crossed, they can't be uncrossed. Have you ever watched confidence drain from a room? Not because someone shouted, but because someone stopped pretending? That's what happened next. I didn't rush. I didn't enjoy the pause. I let it exist. Years of assumptions sat between us, heavy and fragile, and I wanted everyone to feel their weight. Before I spoke again. I don't want an argument, I said. I want clarity. He scoffed. Then be clear. So I was. I won't be taking the job, I said evenly. And I won't be reporting to your son. A ripple moved around the table. Chairs shifted. Glances exchanged. His son tried to laugh. It sounded thin. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You don't understand how things work." "I understand exactly how they work," I replied. "That's why I stayed quiet for so long." That caught his attention. Her father leaned forward. "Quiet about what?" I reached into my jacket. Not quickly. Not theatrically. I took out my phone and placed it on the table. Screen facing him. "I asked my attorney to send something earlier today," I said. "You should have it now." He frowned and read. At first, nothing changed. Then something did. "What is this?" he asked. "It's a disclosure," I said. "A formal one." Silence spread. His son leaned in, read over his shoulder. Then shook his head. "This is a joke." "It isn't," I said. "It's documentation." I didn't list numbers. I explained process. How long-term investments work. How patient capital supports growth. How ownership doesn't always announce itself. Then I said the sentence that changed everything. "For years, I've been a significant shareholder in your company." The word shareholder landed like a dropped plate. He tried to interrupt. I continued calmly. "Large enough to support expansions. Large enough to stabilize difficult quarters. Large enough to call a board meeting when governance becomes a concern." His son stood abruptly. "That's impossible." I nodded. "It feels that way when you've never had to look." Her father's hands trembled as he set the phone down. "Why didn't I know?" he asked. "You never asked," I said. "You assumed." I explained that the investment hadn't been personal. Not at first. It was sensible. Undervalued assets. Careless leadership. Over time, my involvement grew. Quietly, deliberately. Because the company needed discipline. More than noise. "And tonight," I added, "you made it personal." He stared at me, searching for anger. He didn't find it. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone," I said. "I came to stop a pattern." I mentioned the meeting scheduled for the next morning. Not as a threat. As a fact. A review of leadership. A vote on structure. A future not decided by family ties. "You can step aside with dignity," I said. "Or the board will decide without you." The room felt smaller then. Not from pressure. From certainty. I looked at my wife. She was crying quietly. Not from shock, but from release. Our daughter watched steadily. Finally seeing the truth. Without apology. I stood. "This isn't revenge," I said. "It's boundaries." And for the first time in decades, the silence belonged to someone else. Because when truth is documented, it doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to exist. Have you ever noticed how people reveal who they really are? When you don't react the way they expect? That was the moment the room changed. Before I go on, let me say this. If stories about family, dignity, and quiet turning points matter to you, consider subscribing. These aren't fast stories. They're the kind that stay with you. And if you've ever felt underestimated, you'll understand why. Now, I thanked him for the offer. Calmly. Politely. The way you do when you're being tested. And refused to fail on someone else's terms. Then I said, "I'm going to decline." The reaction came fast. Confusion first. Then disbelief. And finally irritation. Sharp enough to cut through the polite atmosphere he'd worked so hard to maintain. "Decline?" he repeated. "You don't understand what I'm offering." "I understand perfectly," I said. "I'm just not interested." That's when his tone shifted. He leaned back, scanned the table, and laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because laughter made him feel in control. "At your age," he said, "most men would be grateful." He smiled thinly. "You've lived a simple life. Limited opportunities. This is a way to finish strong." finished strong. As if my life had been a long apology. My wife's hand tightened around mine. Years of restraint pressed against her silence. I'm comfortable where I am, I said. That was the wrong answer. His voice grew louder, less careful. You've been lucky, he said. My daughter could have had more. A better life. Then he looked directly at her. Instead, she chose simplicity. She chose you. The words weren't meant to hurt me. They were meant to wound her. That's when she stood. Enough, she said. Steady. Firm. You don't get to speak about my husband like that. He waved her off. This doesn't concern you. She laughed once, short, disbelieving. You just insulted my husband. In front of our daughter. Of course it concerns me. He turned back to me. Unwilling to lose control. For decades, he said, I've watched you hold her back. The small house. The old car. No ambition. No progress. There it was. Not concern. Not disappointment. Contempt. He didn't see love. He saw lack. And something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. Silence wasn't protecting anyone anymore. Not me. Not my wife. Not our daughter, who sat watching her grandfather measure worth in numbers and dismiss everything else. I stood slowly. Not dramatically. Not defiantly. Just decisively. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said. He frowned. What are you talking about? I looked around the table one last time. The faces. The assumptions. The hierarchy they believed was fixed. This dinner, I said, was never about offering me anything. I paused. It was about reminding me of my place. The room went silent. And for the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. Because he realized something important. I wasn't upset. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't asking for approval. I was preparing to tell the truth. And once some lines are crossed, they don't get erased.